This is Jim. I'm coming to you from London. I'm delighted to be joined by my distinguished colleagues, Will Tagle and Mark Ryan and Tom McGarity. Georgie, who normally is on the call, has just arrived in Seoul, South Korea, so we'll miss it. But I'm delighted to be joined by these gentlemen today and to begin a discussion of the third of our great books for 2017. And just to bring everyone into the flow, as we start our May trimester, so for some of the students, this will be your first course in the great books. We meet once a month for 90 minutes, and each trimester we take on two great books of history. In the January trimester, we took on Antigone, the great play by the Greek playwright Sophocles, looked at the issue of civil disobedience, which was appropriate in a time of Trump. And then Will led us in an exploration of the Book of Hopi and the prophetic utterances of some of the indigenous seers of North America as they framed the great turning into the next phase of human evolution occurring at the present time. Today, we enter into another great work of human spirituality and history. That's the Dhammapada. And those are the collected sayings of the Buddha. And we do so at a very special time in the calendar. Tomorrow is Vaisakha Day. It's the full moon of May, where by tradition, since he passed 2,500 years ago, the Buddha was born on the full moon in May. He gained enlightenment on the full moon in May, and he experienced what they call his parinirvana, his death, on the full moon in May. So I thought it was appropriate to honor this great avatar of the human family by beginning a 2-month, 2-lecture exploration of his sayings that are captured in the Dhammapada. And of course, are part of a much larger collected works of his sayings and his great deeds and the monastic order that he founded. And what I would like to do is divide this presentation into 2 sections, as those of you who've heard me before know I'm inclined to do. In this first lecture, I just want to talk to you about the Buddha. And then in the second lecture, I'm going to go textual, as I love to do, and we'll just dive into the Dhammapada. And that'll conclude our exploration of this great human being. We'll be returning to the Buddha again and again in the course of these great books. I have a deep respect for the Buddha. In fact, I would say that, people are often asked the questions, who were the greatest 3 people in history, or what were the greatest events, or the greatest wars, or the greatest debacles in history. We love to have our lists. And if I had to choose the greatest person in history at the top of that list, I would say it's the Buddha. I don't know of anyone who comes close to the Buddha in his perspicacity, his penetrating analysis of reality itself. And I hope over the course of these next 2 lectures to set forth the deep genius of this man, that lived 2,500 years ago in southern Nepal, wandered for 45 years in the plain of the Ganges River, and set in motion a religion whose impact is without precedent in the religious and spiritual history of humankind, in its ability to transform human beings into agents of nonviolence and ahimsa, as it's called in the Eastern tradition. So I wanted to initiate these remarks by just offering, on the eve of the day every year that we commemorate the Buddha, by the deep reverence with which I hold the Buddha, and begin by saying that, you know, if you think about the Buddha's life, it's singular among the great avatars. If you think of Lao Tzu, or you think of Confucius, or you think of Mahavira, you think of Zoroaster or Muhammad or Jesus, the great Hebrew prophets. You know, he was the one that distinguished himself by the way that he was born and the way he lived. And Mahavira, who was a contemporary of his, had some very interesting parallels. But if you think about it, how in the West we evaluate our success stories, they're almost always in the genre of rags to riches, or in terms of Pilgrim's Progress, the lowly pilgrim or the lowly warrior that goes out, has many adventures, and finally, after great tribulation and many temptations and the suffering, the vicissitudes of fate, finally conquers, finally succeeds. Sometimes meeting with great tragedy. If you think of Antigone, you think of the Greek tragedians, you think of the different stories. But, you know, in the West, we've always celebrated, you know, Rocky Balboa or Abraham Lincoln, and Cinderella, Epic of Gilgamesh, stories of turbulence and adventure that sometimes come to naught, but often come to great reward after singular effort. The Buddha was very different than that. The Buddha started out with everything most of us spend our lives seeking to achieve. He starts where our stories end, and they lived happily ever after. He began by living happily ever after. That's the extraordinary quality of the Buddha's story. He was born rich, which most of us aspire to. He was born the son of a king. He was the heir to a throne. He was born in the warrior caste of ancient India, so he was a warrior. By all accounts, he was exceedingly handsome. He had great athletic prowess. He had an extraordinarily gifted mind. He had a wonderful personality. He lived in 3 different palaces. He tells the story actually in part of the Pali canon that in the palaces there were 3 ponds, one of blue lilies and one of white lilies and one of red lilies, and that on day by day he was sung to and cavorted by musicians, all of which were ravishing women. At the age 16, he married the most beautiful woman of the court. and by her had a son, Rahula. He had everything most of us think we need to achieve in our life. And then one day, in his late 20s, he meets a man that's obviously diseased. He sees someone who is old. He then sees a dead body. And then he sees a samana, an ascetic, who appears to have given up everything that the Buddha has, that Siddhartha Gautama has, and looks happy. And Siddhartha begins to reflect on the contradiction in which he finds himself. And he comes to the conclusion that he is no exception to what it is that he's observing. And that is the great initial awakening of Siddhartha in the midst of plenitude. He comes to the realization that everything that he has is going to pass away, and that he too is going to become diseased, grow old, and die. And that's worth reflecting on for a moment, because most of us spend most of our lives in denial of that very obvious fact. I remember when I was nearing my 30s and I looked in the mirror one day and I realized that I was getting my first gray hairs. I was initially shocked that it was happening to me. And if you have read Ernst Becker's book, Denial of Death, virtually the entire consumer culture of the United States and the West and our global consumer culture is based on the denial of death. It's based on the myth of everlasting youth. And most of us feel, even into our old age, that we're the exception to what everyone else is going to experience. But it was Siddhartha Gautama's capacity to understand that he, as the man who had it all, actually had nothing. And that the things we spend our lives craving actually bring us no satisfaction, compelled him at age 29 to leave his wife, to leave his son, to leave his throne, to leave his wealth, to leave his courtiers, to leave every single possession, and in secret, in the dead of night, with his most trusted manservant, slip out of the palace on his horse, ride for a little way, get off his horse, take off his robes, cut his hair, give it to his manservant, and walk south into the woods to his destiny. He had everything that all of us believe constitutes happiness. And he gave it all up for a deeper encounter of the mystery of the meaning of human life in the face of illness and old age and death, and the possibility of achieving a state of such sublimity that all craving falls away. I'd like to just pause there and unpack a few aspects of his story. The first one is that the Buddha did not come to this great realization in one lifetime. And I want to touch on this in part because I think it's worth, particularly those of us in the West that have no sense of the transmigration of souls and the notion of rebirth, to contemplate for a moment the great understanding of reality that permeated almost every human culture until the rise of Judeo-Christianity in the West, where it was forgotten. That we've been here before many times. And as part of the Pali canon, they have what they call the Jataka stories. And those are the stories that are attributed to the Buddha before he became Siddhartha. In fact, he recounted to his disciples, it is said, 554 previous lifetimes of the myriad that he had before he came into the incarnation that we know of as the historical person of Siddhartha. And I wanted to just take a moment and offer that as part of our commemoration, with the reflection and the invitation to consider that who we are now, what we do, how we express ourselves, is not just Jim Garrison in this lifetime, but Jim Garrison in this lifetime, Mark Ryan, Tom McGarity, Will Tagle, and all of you, we're the results of billions of years of evolutionary life. Every cell in our body carries memory. We are what we've forgotten. And what we've forgotten at different experiences is remembered. And one of the reasons why Siddhartha was enlightened is because he remembered his previous lifetimes. And he remembered that eons and eons ago, he was born sunyata, in a different world, so far back that there's no even residual in the collective consciousness of humanity. And this monk met the enlightened one of his age and determined to gain enlightenment. And he set forth with such determination and clarity of purpose that he was blessed, and over the eons of time, he reincarnated into many different beings into animals, into birds, into fish, into trees, into kings, into paupers, into warriors. And I'd like to tell you the story of just one of his incarnations, because it's a beautiful story and gives you a sense of how each life takes often one fractal and is crystallized around one moment of choice, where you determine who you are in that moment. And that determines your karmic fate into the next moment and the next incarnation. That's one of the common themes of people who remember their past lives in the great traditions of the avatars of the East. And so Buddha remembered one of his lives when he was born a sala tree in the gardens of a great king in southern India. And he'd reached 60,000 years old. That's how long he had been standing. And one day the king, in the arrogance of his power, said to his courtiers, I want to build a palace. And I want to find me a tree that is so big and so strong that the palace will only have one pillar that will hold up the entire palace. Because I want to build a palace that's never been built before. One pillar to hold up the entire palace. And they searched far and wide, and they couldn't find a tree that was big enough and strong enough for this requirement. And then after they'd come back from their journeys, one of them noted the sala tree in the garden. And they came out to measure it, to cut it down. And the god of the sala tree, the diva of the sala tree, listened to all the other sala trees around him. And they all cried out, if they cut you down, it's going to destroy the whole garden. Because you've been standing for 60,000 years. Unsure what to do, but knowing he had to care for all his children, the deva of the sala tree went to the king in the dead of night and illuminated the king's bedroom with his brilliance. And the king woke with a start. And the spirit of the sala tree said to him, I know you want to cut me down. I've stood for 60,000 years. You can cut me down. But don't do it at once. Cut me down piece by piece by piece. So not even a blade of grass is destroyed around me. And the rest of the garden can continue to live. And the king was so astonished that the spirit of the sala tree was willing to give his life, but wanted to do so in a way that protected all life around him, that he repented of his arrogance and gained enlightenment. And the sala tree and the entire garden was saved. That was just one of the hundreds and thousands of incarnations that went into motion as Sumedha evolved over the eons until he became a god and lived in the heaven of eternal contentment for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And then he looked down on humanity and saw that no one could remember the teachings of the previous enlightened one, and chose India on the foothills of the Himalayas as the right place. And 2,500 years ago, at the end of the 5th century BC, the right time to incarnate. And the way he did it was exquisite. He divested himself of his deity status, descended onto the earth, right into the auric space of Mount Kailash, standing in the center of the Himalayan mountain range, the most holy mountain in the Eastern metaphysical tradition, Mount Kailash. We took a pilgrimage to Mount Kailash last year. And then personified as a white elephant, he came to the queen, Mahamaya, the wife of King Sidonia in southern Nepal, and brushed her right side with a white lotus blossom. And she knew she was pregnant with someone who was going to bring enlightenment to the world. And she carried her son in her womb for 10 lunar months. It happened on the full moon that she was impregnated. And 10 lunar full moons later, right as she was nearing her hometown of Lumbini, she came to her fullness, stopped in a garden of sala trees. That's why I told the story of Buddha as the sala tree. And she leaned against the sala tree, and the Buddha was born. He dropped from her womb effortlessly, and he took 7 steps. And he radiated, it is said, like the sun. And he announced, "This is my last incarnation." 7 days later, his mother died. He was absorbed into the palace till he was 29 under the circumstances I've already described, where he then went out and as he left the palace, he first studied under some gurus. And the first guru was a gentleman by the name of Kalmata. And he was the preeminent yogi master of that age. And he taught the Buddha all the yogic postures and all the breathing techniques, pranayama, until finally the Buddha recalls that he could attain the sphere of what he called beyond materiality. And he realized that wasn't where he needed to go. He needed to go further. And then he left that guru and studied under another guru, where he reached the state where he could meditate beyond perception and non-perception. And then he realized that wasn't enough either. And then he left the domain of spiritual practice, and with 5 disciples went into the realm of asceticism. And for several years engaged in such rigorous ascetic practice that they almost literally starved themselves to death. In fact, there's a famous image that the Buddha recalled in later years. He said he got so thin that he could reach into his stomach and grab his hands around his spine. Just try to do that. Put your hands on your stomach and try to even get near your spine. Most of us have such ample bellies. We're not going to get near that. They slept in graveyards. They would eat a kernel of rice a day. They went into long fasts. The Buddha recalls that on occasion people would pass by and think he was a corpse. And all of a sudden, he realized the same thing he realized while he was in the lap of luxury, while he was doing his spiritual yoga, that asceticism wasn't the answer to disease, old age, death, and contentment. And one day, you know the story, he met a maiden tending some cows, and she offered him some milk. And he drank the milk. And his 5 disciples were so scandalized by the fact that this great ascetic was drinking milk that they left him. And once again, Siddhartha was on his own. He'd left his palace. He'd left wife, son, wealth, everything that we strive for. He had left spiritual practice. How many of us are engaged in almost perpetual spiritual practice? He'd left asceticism. How many of us fast? How many stories do you know in the monastic traditions of rigorous asceticism as the hallmark of the spiritual life? Think of Teresa of Avila. Think of John of the Cross. Think of Francis of Assisi. Siddhartha left it all and said, this is not enough. He'd been at it for 7 years. He was 35 years old by this time. And he recalls, according to the Pali Canon, that he came to a river. And he sat under a sala tree. And he began to daydream. And he remembered an incident from his boyhood where he had sat under a rose apple tree watching his father plow a nearby field. And as he was idly there as a boy, watching his father, he said he began to just note his breath coming in and out. And he decided that that's what he would do. He would find a place and he was going to sit down and just watch his breath. And he was going to stay there until he either gained enlightenment or he died. He wandered about for a while and he found a comfortable place under what they call a peepal tree, later known as the Bodhi tree, the awakening tree. It's by a river. And he sat right under the tree with his back against the trunk. And the stories vary, but the most common one is for 40 days and 40 nights. Siddhartha, in the depth of meditation and breathing almost beyond imagination, he contemplated the true nature of reality itself. And he became awakened. And in the process of his awakening, Mara, the great tempter, came upon him and paraded before him the most voluptuous women possible to imagine. And the Buddha didn't move. He then sought to frighten the awakened one with all manner of evil spirits and marching armies and threats of physical harm. And the awakened one didn't move. He then sought to seduce him with power and wealth. And the awakened one didn't move. And at the end of it all, it is said that the Buddha simply reached with his right hand and with his middle finger, still in full lotus, touched the ground and called upon the earth herself to bear witness that he had gained enlightenment, that he had understood reality as it truly is. Got up, wandered into the village, and for the next 45 years, from age 35 till he himself succumbed to old age, illness, and the disease of death. For life inevitably takes us all, preaching a completely new understanding of reality that changed human perception of who we are in relationship to the larger whole. There are many things I can say about that, and I'll be going into far more detail in the next lecture. I wanted to spend the preponderance of this one just telling the story of the Buddha and summarizing, as I will do now, the penetrating insight that enabled him to come awake. And that is his deep understanding of basically three things. One is impermanence of all being, his great notion of emptiness. The second is the insubstantiality of all things, his great doctrine of anatta, or the non-self. And what they call dukkha in the Pali canon, the great awareness of suffering. Undergirding these, which we will explore in more depth, was a radical reformulation of human epistemology. For the Buddha, only direct knowing suffices to get us to where we need to go. And if you think about how we know what we know, particularly in the West, it's all secondhand. There's virtually no awareness in the Western epistemological tradition, other than in certain philosophical circles. One thinks of David Hume, for example, and John Locke and some of the British philosophers, but in the religious, spiritual traditions, the cultural, civilizational traditions. Just think, for example, you go to school. Almost everything you learn is out of a book. Your teacher tells you it's so-and-so and such and such. If you're religiously inclined, if you're a Christian, you're a Jew, you're a Muslim, religion is about faith. It's not by works that ye are saved, said St. Paul. It's by faith. Faith in Jesus. Faith in somebody else. You're a Muslim, you have faith in the Quran. Muhammad, somebody else, is the great prophet. Think about how much you believe to be true is because you have faith in something. You believe in the Christian tradition. You believe in Torah. You believe in a book or a person. You take authorities, whether it's the Pope or the Dalai Lama. And the Buddha says, anything you believe, anything that you have faith in, is not true. Only direct experience of reality and a radical deconstruction of everything that you think is true will get you to what's really true. It's not about wealth. It's not about a guru. It's not about abundance. It's not about asceticism. Virtually everything we think life is about and spirituality is about isn't even the finger pointing to the moon, says the Buddha. Buddha was one of the most radical people in the history of the world. He cut it all away. all away. And as he sat with a penetrating intelligence and awareness under that Bodhi tree, he came to the most fundamental realization, unprecedented, before or after, except in the Buddhist tradition, confirmed only now, 2,500 years later, by Western science, that there is no there there. There is no there there. There's no there there to faith. There's no there there to the soul. There's no there there to a separate reality. It's empty. Everything is interconnected. Everything is changing all the time. And anytime you try to encapsulate by saying, that is it, here I am, you miss it. And because you miss it, you engage in violence with the rest of the world. Now let's think about that for just a moment, and then we'll open it up for dialogue and reflection. But I want to probe it, because this is the fundamental insight of the Buddha. This is what makes him, in my judgment, if you had to pick one, the most penetrating intelligence of our kind. He was the first one to completely understand that there's no separate self. There's nothing separate in existence. And as you know from physics, which is easiest for us in the Western world to understand, it's the easiest gateway into his illumination. Modern physics says that whatever we believe to be material, like this glass, if you break down its molecular and atomic structure, there's nothing there. It's just configurations of energy that are interconnected as much with the solar system as they are with my hand. You know, one of the early commentators on emptiness offered the example of a tree. He says, you look at a tree, and the tree looks like it's separate, but it isn't. The tree is drawing from the earth, it's drawing from the water around it, it's drawing from the air. It's breathing in the oxygen and giving out the carbon dioxide. It's sucking up the water. Everything about that tree is coming from outside itself. It's absorbing into itself, and then it exhales. It's always interconnected at every level of its being, all the time, and it's always changing. So when you say tree, that is a verbal, that's a intellectual construct for something that actually is not separate. And Lama Anagarika Govinda, one of the most sublime commentators on these matters, in his book, Insights of a Himalayan Pilgrim, that Georgie actually just sent me a few weeks ago, that I've been devouring. It's a beautiful book. Anagarika Govinda, actually, as many of you know, is my root guru in the Buddhism. He really introduced me to the deep profundity of Buddhism. And he has some very illuminating sentences that are beyond my capacity, so I would just read them. But he talks about the fact that when the Buddha talks about the anatta, the non-self, what it really means is not that there's not a self there, not that there's not a tree there, but it's so interconnected with everything else and it's changing in every single part, every instant, that there's no separate thing with it because of its interconnectivity. So when you really get that, says Govinda, what it means is a breaking open and a tearing down of the self-established walls by which human beings separate, encapsulate, and close themselves off from all other beings so that they, in their inability to transcend the boundaries of egocentricity, are incapable of love, incapable of being sympathetic with others, and incapable of rejoicing in the happiness of others. So that's what the Buddha keeps saying. It's empty. All violence, ultimately is born of the illusion that somehow we're separate. And if we come to the radical realization, he says, the radical awakening that it is all interconnected, the word he used, it's all empty. There's no monad, there's no soul that's separate, my soul as opposed to Mark's soul, as opposed to Tom's soul or Will's soul. There's nothing in us that lives forever. Everything in us is changing every instant, every micro instant. That's the emptiness out of which everything emerges. Empty of what? You might ask. Empty of an ego. Empty of the notion that there's any separation between any of us and ultimate cosmic totality. And empty of all propositions, all assertions of faith, all beliefs in an external authority outside ourselves, which means we become free of all limitations and restrictions, and thus we become free of all inhibitions. And let me conclude with Govinda's meditation on the metaphor of the breath. The metaphor of the breath. Because it was the Buddha that generated Vipassana. Just follow the breath. That was originated by the Buddha, Vipassana breathing. With our breath, says Govinda, we incorporate something which exists outside our corporeal being into ourselves. And after a short while, we give it back to the external realm. Thus, in this existence, we cannot take or acquire anything which we do not eventually have to give back. If we take in nutrients, like a tree, and do not dispose of them after digestion, these nutrients will turn into poison, which can kill us. If we inhale air but do not exhale air, we'll suffocate and we'll die within minutes. Whatever we take into our body, we cannot hold on to forever. At the very last moment, our moment of death, we return everything we have breathed in. Think this thought. At the moment of our death, we return everything that we have breathed in back to the larger totality. Thus, in the experience of the breath, we become fully aware of that law which Buddhism regards as basic, the law that life means never-ending change, expressed in the continuous give and take. There is nothing we can look upon as our possession and hold on to, neither our social position nor our wealth. At the very moment in which we merely try to hold on to anything, it turns into a deadly poison. That's why the Buddha left his wife and his son and his palace and his wealth and every single one of his possessions, including his hair. That's why he left spiritual practice. That's why he left asceticism. And finally, at the moment of his awareness, all he had left was his breath. That's all Siddhartha took with him as he sat under the Bodhi tree, was his breath. At the very moment in which we try to hold on to anything, it turns into a poison. And that's why we suffer. This is also true for our worldly possessions, which turn into life-threatening poisons if we cling to them and try to hold on to that which slips out of our control. Then we fixate and we freeze, no longer able to perceive the fullness of life. But at the very moment in which we are capable of letting go of everything without clinging, we are free. When we inhale, therefore, the whole world breathes through our being. We feel that we are again filled with life. We do not feel the breath in our lungs. We can sense the living breath all the way down into our toes and the tips of our fingers. The whole body is rejuvenated by the breath, but only if we exhale after the inhalation. You know the great line of Plotinus in the Aeneads. The whole universe breathes as one. When we breathe, we're the microcosm of the cosmos breathing. And it is this pleroma, always breathing, always inhaling, always exhaling, always changing, always transmuting itself into a new form of which we are ephemeral, momentary gusts. That is at the heart of the Buddhist insight of emptiness and his great notion that emptiness thereby becomes the cradle of compassion and the cure for the insatiability of the mentality of dualism in the separate world. These great aspects of his awareness are condensed in the Dhammapada. And we'll turn to that great text next time. But I now want to open it up for comment and reflection from my distinguished colleagues, starting with Mark Ryan. Mark, welcome aboard.
Jim, thank you for that beautiful presentation and in all of its aspects. Let me just make a couple of really rather light observations to begin with, and then one further reflection. As an evidence of the interconnection, I just observe, and this is something I haven't often heard, but that when the Buddha began his trek out from the palace, he was in his, astrologically speaking, in his his first Saturn return.
Yes.
So that brings in another aspect of interconnectedness of the relation,
Totally.
the individual personality with the cosmos, that I think is very interesting. Another such observation, I'm currently teaching a course here in the educational at the Jung Center of Houston on Frederick Myers, whom we discussed his major book in this great books course last year. But I just one observation relating to your stories about reincarnation. Myers had a very profound psychology, I think, and really one that was quite related to Eastern thought in when he lived in the late part of the 19th, early 20th century. And but he didn't think much of the idea of incarnation. He didn't find the kind of evidence for it that he was looking for to give some empirical substance to, or empirical arguments for spiritual realities. But I'm in teaching this course. I'm now in communication with a medium, and we are. The last class is tonight, so this is on my mind.
Oh,
And
fantastic.
the medium claims to be in touch with Frederick Myers, and the medium has just published a book on reincarnation, in which he interviews Frederick Myers in the other realm about this idea. And Myers now acknowledges reincarnation, according to my medium. He's changed his mind on the other side, and sees it not as something that everyone goes through, but something that there are differences from the Buddhist way of telling this story, but something that one does have a choice to do if you go to another realm. So I see that as part of a larger trend in the West to see more validity than we have in general to concepts such as reincarnation. But perhaps a slightly more profound thought. I loved your explanation of no self and interconnection and emptiness, and that was a very powerful and beautiful explication of all of that, and the drawing on Enrique Govinda was brilliant there. I just want to point out some of the challenge of this, though, and I think this is something that you're no doubt will talk about. I'm sure it is next time, because these two are intellectual constructs that we're working with, and as you state, the real effort of the Buddha is to get to some direct realization of these things. All of those constructs can easily be misinterpreted or interpreted in a very limited fashion, and they become subjects for Buddhist debate within the tradition, but this pushes us to the realization that what is required is not just right thinking. It's not just right thought in the sense of understanding these concepts, but the process by which we come to that realization. It pushes us to look at the pathway, not just the signposts along the way, so that you are having to really, in order to come to any really true realization of these notions, they have to be an internal experience, which is a very major point within the Buddhist tradition, but one that's not easy to follow, of course, because these Buddhist notions are also intellectual constructs, and they inevitably get altered or understood at a new dimension if we have some kind of direct experience of them. So that pushes us to talk about the process of meditation, the process of turning within, where these realizations are somehow where they are discovered, and in a way that's beyond the rational, and it also pushes us, I feel, to a deep respect for each individual's process, because each of us, being only a small expression of the broad realm of consciousness, has to have our own pathway to coming to direct experience. And therefore, the great truths that you and I discover may not be something that is all that useful to someone else who must go through another deep internal process in some other form in order to come to realization. So I look forward to discussing some of that notion of process in our next class.
Well, just to do a quick comment before Will enters the fray, I think this issue of reincarnation is very important, and I brought it in actually very intentionally to honor Tom, who wrote his dissertation on aspects of past lives, and I just wanted to underscore the universality of this awareness in deep antiquity. And I think you're right that it's starting to permeate again into the West after about 1,500 years of forgetting. And I would say to make two quick comments on your notion of awareness. The one is that unlike in the West, where there's been a conflict between science and religion since the rise of science and the rise of Christianity, the doctrines of Christianity, for example, are so antithetical to the doctrines of science that much blood has been spilt and people burnt at the stake, and that doesn't exist in Buddhism at all. Not a single person's ever been burned at the stake in Buddhism for scientific fact, because Buddhism is based on science. And that's something we should consider. This is what I mean by the fallacy of faith and the fallacy of belief. That's at variance with the radical existential truth of being itself. You know, what the scientists and the nuclear physicists and the cosmologists are uncovering is what the Buddha said 2,500 years ago. And that's why the Dalai Lama and these Buddhist gurus sit down with scientists all the time. Because Buddhism is based on a radical analysis of reality. Don't believe in anything. The last words that Buddha said, as you point out, before he died, the disciples say, "Tell us something, oh wise one, tell us something." They wanted to believe in something. They wanted to have faith in something. He said, "No. Work out your own salvation. Have your own direct experience." And part of the discipline of the Buddhist meditative practice is go into anything that you think is real. Is it your material form? Is it your emotions? Is it your perceptions? Is it your constructs? The five aggregates, as they say, that make a person a person. You go into any of them, ultimately there's no there. And it's out of that radical analysis, which is ultimately science, a direct knowing of existence as it really is, that your spirituality will emerge, but it has to be connected with the real. And the second one, to your point, is around the breath. And the Buddha said, ultimately, just follow your breath. And that inhalation, exhalation, that breathing, that vipassana, is really all you need when you sit under the Bodhi tree, man. I mean, because that's about as existentially real, because you got to be breathing all the time. And Will has, you know, a half a dozen interpretations of how breath is refracted through different languages. But that radical deconstruction of reality to what it really is existentially, which is nothing, which is empty, and it's empty because there's no boundaries. Not that there's nothing there, it's all there. in an interconnected Indra's web that gives us the basis of compassion. And that's why it gives us the basis for nonviolence. And we'll talk more about that, because next time I want to juxtapose the effects of dualism, which is the metaphysic of the West, with the effects of emptiness, the metaphysics of Buddhism. And you have completely different historical manifestations as a result of that. But anyway, that's next time. We'll jump in, and then we'll have Tom, and then we'll get some students.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Jim, for a very nuanced telling of this story. And in the end, all we have is a story.
That's it.
And it's a very good story. I point out a few things. Even though every person has to work out their own pathway, it's very important for us to notice how Buddha and other enlightened persons find their way into a larger consciousness. So some of these comments I'm making are the result of your insights that are in some ways fresh for me. At age 29, he didn't just ride a horse. He didn't just leave his family. He walked south.
Yeah.
And where did he go? Into the woods. Joseph Campbell says in his comments on King Arthur, as King Arthur sent his knights out, they went into the forest, but they followed the path that was already there and therefore did not find what they needed to find.
Mm-hmm.
Walking south in the indigenous way is going first into not only your vulnerability, but also your felt sense of your vulnerability versus your cognitive perception. And then at age 35, he came to a river and sat by a salad tree and remembered eventually a tree from his childhood. And then his journey continues. He comes to another river. Notice he doesn't really go to a sangha.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't really go into a temple.
That's right.
He goes to the river. And he sits with the tree, and he brings with him a sense that he was a tree. And this boundary, not only between him and the tree, but also that transcends space and time, is the experience out of which, the direct experience out of which these various formulations that we call the Dhammapada and the Sangha and Buddhism itself, which I might take issue with you that Buddhism, I think it has its own issues here, but we can talk about that later on. But I want to point out that Buddha Gautama was drawing on this great moment of insight that the deep interconnection happens experientially through this nature-based pathway. And that's an insight, I think, that I would argue that it might be impossible to grasp what Buddha was teaching without that direct connection with the river and the breath and the tree.
Exactly.
And that it's a cycle. It's not linear, it's cyclical. And that applies not only to individuals, but to culture itself. And I'm going to pause there because I sure want to hear what Tom has to say.
Yeah, but thank you, Will. I just wrote down this notion that the Buddhist enlightenment was a nature-based pathway, and let's take that theme up again next time, because I think it's fundamental to understanding the profundity of his insight. Yeah, so thank you for that. Tom, you have a few reflections?
I do. You know that I always do. I want to suggest one really important point, and then I want to go further to what I had prepared. This is my ad lib moment, I guess. What I want people to understand, one of my messages in life for people is, don't spend too much time putting people on pedestals, the avatars, the teachers, the leaders, because you are here to experience for yourself what you need to experience in this particular lifetime. 10 years ago, I wrote this to Will and some others just yesterday or the day before, I think. And it's in my book, which I'll describe briefly. But 10 years ago, I was sitting in my office in my home, having just come off a 25-year, very successful investment career. And I was sitting in my office thinking, I have this beautiful life. I have the beautiful wife, a beautiful set of children. There's beautiful money in the bank. I'm in a new second career, which is bringing me beautiful moments every day. In a way, similar to what Jim said about having everything a man could want to have in this world and in this lifetime. But I said to myself on this one afternoon 10 years ago, I really have nothing. I know I have nothing. None of this is real. I had this sense that this was just the movie called Tom, a movie that I had played the lead role in many, many times, and yet I'd never read a book on past lives, reincarnation, none of that in this lifetime, to my knowledge. But I had a sense that I played this role many times, and I really didn't want to play it again. I said to myself, I'm tired of the story of Tom. I want what's real. Show me what's real. And I spoke out loud. Show me what you want me to see, and I will follow you wherever you want me to go. And from that moment on, my life has never been the same. I wrote my doctoral dissertation here at this university, at the Wisdom School, on the topic of mysticism, which is the unity with the divine, with the oneness, with the allness. And it's brought about in a variety of ways, it said. And one of those ways is surrender, which is what I did that day 10 years ago. I surrendered Tom, my identity as Tom, with my identity as part of the unity with the divine. And from that moment on, it's been an incredible series of experiences. My dissertation was on mysticism, and I explored it, having felt it, through a number of very unusual modalities, which were all available to me at Wisdom University, coincidentally. Dreams, near-death experience, vision quest, altered states of consciousness. Particularly, I studied holotropic breath work under Stan Grof's tutelage. Sacred pilgrimage to Teotihuacan, to Chartres, past life regressions, and the time in between lives, which I found by far the most fascinating. And I wrote about those in this book, my dissertation called Divine Power Speaks with the Buddha, which is kind of interesting that we're talking about the Buddha today. This book, this dissertation, really was a conversation with the Buddha. And not with Buddhism, and not with anything I'd ever heard about the Buddha. It was conversation with the Buddha, because what I've always wanted and always experienced was the experience first, and then corroborate it with what I've then was presented in reading literature or conversation with others. And I knew that there had been thousands of books and written on the Buddha and Buddhism, and I didn't want to talk about it. That wasn't the conversation. So I went to what I consider the authority on mysticism, a man named Eknath Easwaran, who's also a translator and commentator on classic Indian spirituality. And I went to his website, to him, and with the idea that, where do I go to speak with the Buddha? And he said, the purest sense of what the Buddha said comes to you in the Dhammapada. Everything else is about the Buddha. The Dhammapada is the Buddha, is exactly the words the Buddha said. So that at the end, each chapter in my dissertation was the mystical experience wrapped with scientific, classical context for people to understand, mystical experience, contextual, scientific contextual framework, and then somehow or another, a series of human healings entered the picture, which is what I wrote about. But at the end of each chapter, I incorporated a conversation with what the Buddha would have thought about that particular subject matter in each chapter, and those words came directly from the Dhammapada. My favorite piece of the conversation, I've written this down, came inside a chapter that I wrote on the time between lives. And in the Buddha's Dhammapada was the verse called age. And he said, I have gone through many rounds of birth and death, looking in vain for the builder of this body. Heavy indeed is the birth and death again and again. But now I have seen you, house builder. You shall never build this house again. Its beams are broken, its dome is shattered, self-will is extinguished, nirvana is attained. That, my friends, is what you're looking for. This is not about the Buddha. This is not about the modalities, and it's not even about mysticism. What it is hopefully an opportunity to feel those notions in a very experiential, spiritual way, and notice how those things, those experiences, are actually quite relevant to your own history in this lifetime. And as you notice that, and you decide to go deeper with your understanding of who you are and what you are, you then begin to live a life that you never imagined. So lastly, I would say, rediscover who or what you really are. Find your purpose. Believe it, live it, and most of all, share it. Namaste, my friends.
Thank you, Tom. By the way, Tom did an excellent job, and he took on, I'd thought about past lives before, but Tom was interested in the space between the past lives. I can still remember that conversation with Tom. I'd never thought that thought before. And Wisdom University at the time, now Ubiquity, is probably the only school anywhere that would say, let's do a PhD out of this. It was a subject worth exploration. So I just wanted to commend Tom's dissertation to any of you who are interested in these matters. It's the kind of dissertation we like to feature. So thank you, Tom. I'm realizing we're almost out of time.
And the Fibonacci numbers tend to be very grounding. The Lucas numbers tend to be very spiritual. And if you blend the two systems, you get this sort of fifth dimensional viewpoint of the cosmos. It's interesting that the Buddha started his journey when he was 29, which is a Lucas number. So he was at a point in his life when he was looking for a spiritual journey. When you blend the Fibonacci and the Lucas numbers, one of the numbers you get is 555, which is a dimensional frequency. And the Buddha said he had been 554 previous lifetimes, so he was in his 555th previous lifetime. And one of the Rinpoches I studied with in Nepal, I said, how do I best understand the life of the Buddha? And he said, you need to sit on the spot where he was born. So I traveled to Lumbini and sat overnight on the exact spot, which is believed to be his birthplace, and experienced the frequency of the earth, which birthed him. Because that was a very, I think it was very important, the spot on the earth that he was birthed. And that frequency there was 555. So he came into a spot on the earth, based on all my geomantic experience, that had the same frequency of his past lives, bringing him into the 555th life. He was then 29 years old on a spiritual number, and the blend of those two things brought about what we ended up with.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the mathematics of all this is quite sublime and penetrating. And for those of you who want to take a deeper dive, we're doing arithmetica as our fourth liberal arts, fifth liberal art, I think, this year. And Kaylin's going to be giving one of the lectures. Thinking about it, Tom, you ought to come over to Chartres if you have the time. Tom is the faculty of our transformational math course that many people around the world are taking now to very, very good effect. What constitutes emptiness? This is the great insight of Pythagoras. It's sound, it's color, and it's frequencies, it's mathematical equations. And that's what we're going to be exploring in Chartres, the mathematical equations of emptiness. Let me close with just a comment on the Dhammapada. 1 month after the passing of the Buddha, all his disciples gathered. And Ananda, who was his personal assistant for his ministry, was asked to recite from memory his sermons. And in the Pali canon are 5,000 sermons recited by Ananda about the Buddha. He had an unbelievable memory. But whereas, with the Gospels, there's all this debate, did Jesus say it, did Jesus not say it, et cetera, and, Confucius with the Analects and Lao Tzu with the Tao Te Ching. With the Dhammapada, there's universal consensus by just about every scholar and throughout the Buddhist world that the words of the Dhammapada, taken from Ananda as a direct memory and oral transmission, express the essence of the Buddha. It's clear. There's no redaction in the Dhammapada. A book like the Bible, built over time in different places by different scholars and sometimes over centuries. With the Dhammapada, it's clear it came out kind of whole with one mind. And that's what we're going to be exploring in our next call. In the meantime, don't forget, we want everybody, particularly those of you who are students, to interact on our Facebook page. It's very important that we all interact on our Facebook page. And Dan will get this lecture out in the next couple of days. And then I'll send that out with a letter. So Dan, as soon as you get it, send it to me and I'll send the link out to all the students. And then we have a list of all the participants and with a link to our Facebook page. That's very important that we continue the dialogue on this on Facebook between now and next month, when we'll dive into the text of the Dhammapada. Thank you, everyone. Great discussion. Love the Buddha. And remember, tomorrow is the full moon in May. And so as you think about tomorrow, think about the fact that this man was born on the full moon in May, was enlightened, age 39, age 35 on the full moon in May, and then passed, age 80, on the full moon in May. And when he died, to Will's point, he died lying on the ground between two sala trees and experienced his parinirvana. Happy full moon, everyone. Happy Buddha's birthday. Bye-bye.